And I'll get my gavel out, make it official. And good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and call this session of the City of McCleary Hearing Examiner to order. For the record, today is June 6th, 2022 at 2 p.m. We have one item on the agenda today. This is the Sunset View Subdivision Variance request, and it involves a request for approval of a variance from the minimum lot width requirements of Table 1724.030 of the McCleary Municipal Code from 60 feet down to 40 feet, ultimately to allow development of a preliminary plat to subdivide 35.80 acres on 5 parcels into 160 lots for single-family residential development. Under the municipal code, a separate hearing will be required to address the preliminary plat itself. So I note that the request today relates specifically to the variance and not to the plat itself, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. But to introduce myself, my name is Andrew Reeves. I'm a hearing examiner with Sound Law Center, who the city has selected to hold certain land use application hearings like this one. And today it will be my role to collect evidence in the form of exhibits and testimony to determine whether this proposal complies with the city's comprehensive plan and the specific requirements for approval of a variance under section 1740-100 of the municipal code. To that end, I received several exhibits in advance of the hearing that I had an opportunity to review. These include a staff report prepared by city staff, the application materials themselves, an applicant memorandum from Vector Engineering, site plan information on the notice that went out in relation to today's hearing, as well as several public comments. And the number I currently have is 10, but I'll ask city staff about that momentarily to make sure I have received all of the exhibits that have come in. Speaking of that, so I'm going to label those 1 through 6, and 6 will be the public comments with 1 through 10 as sort of sub-exhibits, and that'll help us keep track of things. Those wishing to testify, members of the public will have that opportunity, but to explain the order that will follow today is first we'll hear from city staff, who will give a brief overview of the proposal and the review process that led us to our hearing today. Following that, we'll hear from the applicant, and that will be their opportunity to present any additional information they feel that myself or members of the public should be aware of. After that, I'll go ahead and see if there are members of the public interested in testifying, and at that time, you certainly will have that opportunity. So what I'll do when we get to that point is, for those that are using their computers, I'll ask that they hit the you know what? Raise hand is not enabled. That's probably my fault. I apologize. So what we'll do is I'll go down the list and I'll call on folks. For folks that are calling in on their phones, I believe they'll have to hit *6 and then I will unmute them. But I will again very clearly indicate who should be talking at which stage in the proceeding. And to be clear on how this works, unlike a council meeting, there's not going to be an opportunity for sort of back and forth question and answer session. But if folks have questions, I ask that they sort of indicate when they're testifying that, you know, my name is such and such. I have a question about traffic, and I hope that someone can provide additional information on that issue. And I'll take notes, and I ask that city staff and the applicant take notes. And after we've heard from all members of the public interested in testifying, I'll go back to the applicant and city staff to respond to any such testimony. I don't strictly adhere to a 3-minute rule, as often occurs with council meetings, but I ask, with this many folks interested in participating, that folks try to limit their comments to approximately 3 minutes so that everyone has an opportunity to participate. And further, I note that those that have submitted comments in advance of the hearing, I'll try to identify when I call on you that I have received your comments, but those have been included in the record, and I will certainly further review them in advance of any decision. But I ultimately don't need folks to reread into the record the comments that they've already submitted as written comments, because they are part of the record. I have reviewed them, and I will further review them before making any decision. So for efficiency, no need to do that. I promise that I give just the same weight to those written comments as I do to the testimony that folks provide in this hearing. So that's the basic way in which we're going to do things. I thank everyone for being here. And with that, I'm going to get Todd Bond sworn in, and we'll get started. So Mr. Bond, thank you for being here. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth in the testimony you give here today?
I do.
Thank you. And can you clearly state your name and spell it for the record and explain your role here at the city?
My name's Todd Bond. First name's Todd. Last name is B as in boy, AUN as in Nancy. Director of Public Works here at the City of McCleary. And I was the one that wrote the staff report on this. So.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Quickly, in terms of exhibits, the numbers that I had made the staff report exhibit 1, the application exhibit 2, the applicant memorandum 3, the site plan exhibit 4, information on notice exhibit 5, and the public comments as exhibit 6. And does that track with sort of what you had hoped to have me review in advance of the hearing?
Yes.
And then in terms of the public comments, the number I have is 10, and I'm just quickly going to read who those came from to make sure I'm not missing any. So I had comments from Sean Barlow, Sarah Light, Larry Birondelli, Dan Holcomb, Terry Franklin, I want to say Ivan Grantham, Pamela Sinclair Nixon, Lisa Rook and Joseph Cox, Renee Volz, and Heather Kittleson. Does that track with what you had sent me in your mind?
Yes, that's what I currently have.
Okay, great. So those 10 exhibits are admitted into the record. And I know with the public comments, there were attachments to some of those, and I have those included as part of the record as well. So with that, Mr. Bond, I'll let you go ahead and sort of explain what the proposal is and how we got here.
Yeah, so early May this year, we received an application from Vector Engineering for the request in the variance, which, sorry, I'm jumping between computer things, which the variance request to the zoning minimum lot sizes, and they're proposing to reduction to the required minimum lot size while maintaining underlying zoning minimum density requirements. As you see in the staff report, they basically want to reduce the minimum lot size of what we currently have of 60 feet down to 40 feet, which then also affects the our minimum lot area in square feet, and possibly the minimum yard requirements concerning the side yards abutting to streets. So other than that, everything else is in my report that you have, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Sure. I guess procedurally, the challenge I have is that my understanding under the municipal code is that any hearing on the preliminary plat itself would come before me, the hearing examiner. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, yes.
And so often in situations like this, we have a consolidated process, and essentially an applicant would seek a preliminary plat that has a variance request related to the zoning requirement. So I guess the challenge I have is I'm essentially determining whether it would be appropriate to reduce this zoning standard without a full analysis of the plat.
Right.
And further, SEPA review is not typically required for variance requests, and I certainly have no issue in agreeing with that. But SEPA review for and SEPA being our State Environmental Policy Act, apologies to the audience. But traditionally, you have review under SEPA that occurs at the earliest stage possible and sort of analyzes, you know, whether there would be potential impacts to a project early on, and that review sort of addresses everything. Whereas here, again, with the variance, I'm not being asked to review any kind of SEPA determination because one has not yet occurred. So is it the idea that ultimately I'm just thinking about this one dimensional standard that's being asked to be deviated from, and then SEPA review would occur later and a plat hearing would occur later?
Yes, that's correct. Ryan could probably answer more to this, but I'm assuming that if, depending on what the outcome of the variance hearing is, that adjusts their plat. So, I mean, if they're planning on 160 homes with the current request, I'm guessing if that request is denied, they will adjust their plat as needed. And I believe they will go through that process at that time.
And, okay, so in terms of what I have before me in the materials, I do have a plan, a plat plan. I think I made that exhibit. Check. 4 was the site plan. And presumably that site plan addresses, you know, or proposes the 40-foot minimum width of the lots, but there are no, unless I'm missing that, and perhaps the applicant can speak to it. I don't see any actual numbers in terms of dimensions or widths of any of the lots or size. And I guess the challenge is there apparently is, according to the plan, a type F stream potentially impacting the property along with the category 3 wetland. And I don't have any critical areas reports in front of me to review. So I guess my challenge is, how do I determine if the request is the minimum necessary without knowing what the site constraints are? Has the city given any thought to that?
Yeah, we have. And again, we believe that was going to happen during the preliminary plat process and the SEPA review. And that would be following the variance decision.
Okay. I know we don't have these hearings very often. Has this come up before? I guess my challenge is, I think traditionally I would hear, again, a consolidated hearing for the plat along with the variance. So this is somewhat unique in my experience, but have you had any experience with something like this, Mr. Bond?
No, this is my first variance hearing that I've had at the city of McCleary. I believe the last one we've had was in early 2000s. So yeah, and that's where we're at on that. So.
Okay. Well, I think at this point, it would probably be helpful to hear from the applicants. So what I'm going to do then is move to Ryan Moore, our applicant, and I'll get him sworn in. Mr. Moore, thank you for being here. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth in the testimony you give here today?
I do.
Thank you. And could you clearly state and spell your name for the record and explain who you are?
Ryan Moore, RYANMOORE. I'm from Vector Engineering. We are a small civil engineering firm with offices in Tumwater and Elma. We are representing Mitchell Development LLC out of Puyallup on this project. They are the proposers for the plat. So,
okay. So I guess if you were following my conversation with Mr. Bond, you know, part of my challenge is when addressing the criteria for a variance, you know, one of the criteria, this is true under the municipal code as well as state law generally, is to determine whether it is for the minimum necessary, and without site information, critical areas information, I don't have a lot to go off of, but can you sort of speak to the thought process and why it would be appropriate to hear the variance independent of the plat?
Absolutely. First, I should thank the city for being willing to do this. we did push for it for the specific reasons I'm going to cover here. And in the master plan, I'm not sure which version you have, but if we need to enter more into the record, I'll certainly help. You can see the type F stream as well as the wetland. We had delineation performed as part of this. We have the plat documents ready to go, but what is tripping us up is the amount of lots that we can get due to the wetland. And so the reason we asked for this out of turn a little bit was, or out of turn before the plat hearing, was because the minimum lot sizes that we could generate for this site did not pencil out from the perspective of the full development for the guy doing it. So what we wanted to do was see if the city and the community would support smaller lots, and so that's kind of why we're here. And I should explain a little bit about the plat before we get to the technical stuff. I'm sure that a lot of the neighbors know First Street gets underwater during periods of the winter time, and that site, and this site in particular, has a lot of drainage, wetlands, and creekways on it. And so the development we're proposing is basically maximizing the amount of lots we could get while minimizing all the impacts to that area. And beyond that, part of the proposal that we're working on through our SEPA process will be working along the existing First Street to bring it up to city code, as well as raise it to intercept most of the floodwater that is affecting those downstream sites, that being the park and the Rainbow Apartments, as well as some of the effects upstream. So the point that we're getting at is that maximizing our on-lot usage and the roads are we need these smaller lots. So I have kind of put together a little hearing memo that I'll read from, or essentially, and I'll enter it into the record later.
Okay.
And so basically I'll just run through everything, and then you can ask me questions after. There's 5 parcels involved. They total about 35.8 acres, which under McCleary zoning, you could essentially get 214 residential units if you could reach the maximum density. This process we're at here proposes 160 units at the very highest end, and that would mean all the stream mitigation and steep slopes are mitigated. It's probably not that likely. I think 110 is probably the low end. 120 is probably reasonable. All of the access proposed is going to end up being off of the First Street right away, and then a little bit along First Street itself. But the Mompson Street access lots are probably not part of this project, but we're going to leave them in for now as we discuss the lot widths. A lot of jurisdictions have a planned unit development, which is basically they let you be creative with your lot sizing so that you can have less impact on the open spaces, wild spaces, stormwater, and wetland areas. And McCleary doesn't. So I believe this hearing is sort of stepping ahead of that planned unit development program, and letting us, we're trying to be creative with what we use for on lot areas and how much open space we end up leaving. As part of this project, as I stated, there's 35 acres in it, but by the end of our work, even if we were to reach the maximum development level, 21.5 acres would be left aside for the ponds, the buffers, the wetlands, and the streams. So essentially about 14 acres of it would be left, plus the new right of way and roads. So as Todd stated, we're looking to deviate from 60-foot width down to 40-foot width and minimum lot size below 7,200 based on what comes out at the end. And so I'll go through the code section 16.64 gives the conditions for granting for you to grant, and I'll kind of run through each of those in a line item way, and then I'll kind of show you the map as we go. So condition A, there are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions which apply to the land referred to in the application and so on. And basically, throughout the city of McCleary, you can find a lot of lots that are 40 feet wide. Along Mumpson, there's a few 40 feet and 50 feet wide lots, and then up along Beck Street, just north of the stream buffer and the First Ave access for this parcel, there's also 40-foot lot widths. Now the lots in this project, and can I share screen? Is that okay?
Let me see if let's see. I do not appear to have the ability to let you share the screen. I apologize. Is there?
That's okay. I can explain, but what I was going to show is that a lot of these lots, especially along the wetland and along some of the hills, could be made to meet city of McCleary standard for depth. So we could go 40 feet wide and then give you that whatever you need depth to get to that 7,200 square foot minimum. But those would all have backyards that encroach the wetland buffer. That's allowed by the code, but we think a better use would be to limit the lot size and leave the wetland buffers and the open spaces under contiguous use by or ownership by the homeowners association. So when you look at our map and you're reviewing this, you're going to see the stormwater. There's a lot of stormwater ponds. Those are all designed for treatment, and they would allow their overflows into the wetland. So the wetland functionality and the stream functionality are all affected by this, but to the minimum feasible that we could go. So the lot size reduction is really based on trying to keep backyards from being in wetlands and stream buffers, which is tracking along other jurisdictions' use of the planned unit development, where they let you shrink your lot size so that you don't affect the open areas as much. And so that's why we're going with this non-conforming width. But when you're reading the conditions for granting, you'll see that there are other lots in the areas that have that same width or sometimes less. The next part of 1660, let's say it was 64050, is granting is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of the substantial property rights of the petitioner. And as stated, they're willing to commit, nearly 2/3 of the property to wetland, pond, and open space, as well as reduction, including increasing some of that open space to have flood capacity for the First Street flood issues. And so the variance is really just gaining back some of that given back development capacity for this parcel or this list of parcels. So there's the item B. And then item C is the granting of the application will not, under the circumstances of the particular case, affect adversely the health or safety of persons residing or working in the neighborhood of the property referred to in the application. There's more to it, but essentially the zoning in the area is 6 units per acre. We're proposing somewhere between 4.5 to 3.5. So, if you're buying in the 6 unit per acre zoning, you could expect to get to that. And furthermore, beyond just the additional utility payers for the city of McCleary and the residents there, this project will develop first and the unnamed right away that enters Summit Road north of, I guess, the Dollar General now. It will develop those to a safe opening, full sidewalks all the way out to the streets, as well as the proposer has stated on record to us he'd be willing to fund. The McCleary Code funds ask you to add open space for your people living there, but they would be willing to add it on site or fund improvements at the park right across the street, which seems like a better use for the money, since there's a park right there. So we would gain connectivity to that park and a little money for it. So I'll enter this into the record once we're done, and you can have all of those things I just stated, which is also in the memo. I just clarified it a little bit. So I'm ready for your questions.
So we'll make your memorandum, new memorandum, Exhibit 7.
Okay.
And so I guess I certainly understand what the request is, and I work in 55 jurisdictions in Washington, so I am aware of what a planned unit development or PDD, PUD, there's lots of names for it. What that process is, so but I guess my challenge here is, again, if I'm focused on the criteria specific to, a variance request, one of the things I need to think through is this the minimum necessary to allow reasonable use of the property? So is it the applicant's contention that 160 units is the minimum necessary for a project to move forward?
I mean, the minimum necessary, of course, is a function of the market, but at some point, if it gets below, if at the development level, that if we tried to meet the 60-foot lot width, each of these lots would be forced out into that wetland, and the mitigation requirements and that type of stuff would ultimately affect the wetland more. We think with this wetland and streams more, we think with this mechanism, we can just take a big chunk out of this property without pushing so hard on the edges of with the fringe of the wetland. I think that's really why we're doing it. Like I said, we have the studies done, but if we have to go in under the others, then we're going to have a much heavier footprint in the critical areas. And ultimately, I think a lot of those will be successful through the study program.
Well, I guess my question then, Mr. Moore, is if this process were consolidated with the preliminary plat process, we would have a SEPA determination, we would have environmental review, I would have all the critical areas reports, I would have stormwater, potentially a preliminary stormwater report. Others, members of the public, have provided soils reports, so I do have some information. But if it were a consolidated process, that would, in my mind, allow me to think through whether that quote minimum necessary is being met. Right now, it is so theoretical. It almost is a request to change the zoning laws of the city, almost a spot rezone, or allow for a PUD on this one. And it's not one property, it's 5 properties. And based on the very limited record I have, it's a very abnormal shape. So that's my challenge. I am really struggling to think how on earth I have the necessary information to make a determination on whether, again, this is the minimum necessary without that information. And so, your thoughts are welcome. I just, in my mind, a consolidated process that was both the plat hearing with the zoning request, the variance request thrown in would have made more sense in my mind, because again, with that, and even I don't even have any economic justification, no real numbers on why 160. I mean, if you could build 100 homes, maybe you wouldn't need the variance. I don't know where that number came from. And sorry, I've got background noise. I'm trying to.
I cleaned it up. It was.
Thank you. So that's the challenge I'm facing, Mr. Moore. Can you, again, I understand what a PUD is. I understand the applicant, why it would like one, but that mechanism doesn't exist under the current zoning laws. And that's a political decision. The council would have to change, the code to allow for a PUD. I get, well, and here's another thought too. You keep saying the applicant is willing to do, provide additional open space. But if there is no open space requirement for preliminary plats under the municipal code, that's something I'd have to think through too, in terms of whether this is the minimum necessary. And further, I don't have any real information on the wetland other than being told it's I think category 3 on the plan.
Yeah.
But to say, a certain amount of land is going to be set aside, it's required to be set aside, I assume, because of the critical area. It's not just, oh, we set it aside because it'd be nice to have open space, right?
Sure. And I think a big answer to that is that if you go in, so would you expect the preliminary plat to be submitted with the variance included? I think that's what the assumption is that if you submit the preliminary plat per the current code with the variance added, right, it's two different projects. One's maybe a 70 lot or 60 lot, and the other one's 160 lot. So there's a different set of studies, a different set of requirements, a different set of impacts. And I think that's really what the city and Vector, when we butted heads over this, that's what we came to, is that it's a completely different project. And the preliminary plat fee for 160 lots is 160,000, and the preliminary plat, or whatever it is. And so it's two different projects. So we end up having two hearings anyway, most likely, if you start with the 70 lot subdivision meets the code and a 160 lot adder. I guess that's sort of where this came from.
Well, I guess my thinking is, again, you just said if a 70 lot proposal is feasible, then how on earth is a variance appropriate? Or if a 80 lot proposal is feasible,
Right. It's not feasible. That's what we're getting at here. Right.
Well, so what I need from you, Mr. Moore, what is minimum necessary? I mean, what is the minimum ask? You're saying,
sure,
in the applicant's mind, if it's not 160, we can't move forward. Is that the basic concept?
No, that's not the basic concept. The basic concept is like that, though. I mean, we do have a feasibility study. And now and economic information does affect your decision. Is that true?
Well, the challenge, again, I don't know how, it's your burden ultimately, and this is highly unusual in my experience. I'll just read the code, under the municipal code, section 1740-100B. The variance needs to be necessary because unusual practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships exist for the applicant. Also, it needs to be in harmony with the intent of the zoning ordinances in a comprehensive plan. And in addition, it needs to be the minimum necessary to allow reasonable use of the property. And finally, it needs to ensure, that there's no conferring of special privileges to the applicant that would not be available to other properties in the zoning district. And the one I'm really hung up on is the idea of, is this variance for the minimum necessary adjustment to allow reasonable use of the property? There's lots of law out there on what constitutes reasonable use. There's, unfortunately for developers, there's case law that says, being able to use a boat on a property constitutes reasonable use. Washington tends to lean more toward reasonable economic use, and there's case law to that effect. But without any additional information on why the developer believes 160 is necessary versus what it would like to have, it's difficult for me to make a decision. So I can't tell you what to provide to me. I'm just telling you, ultimately, I have gotten very little in terms of what I have for review in the record. And
okay, I mean,
if you have other information you feel that it would be appropriate for me to review, I'm happy to include it as exhibits, but it's a real challenge to say, without knowing any details, again, about the critical areas, the other encumbrances, it's difficult for me to weigh in and say, yeah, that seems to be the minimum necessary to reduce that standard from 60 feet to 40 feet
Sure.
without additional information.
Okay, I do have quite a bit of additional information that I could provide to you, both the stormwater design for what you have, the feasibility analysis for the construction of the roads and data, and our feasibility analysis to get the work done. So, and also some flood and some wetland information as well. It's all already available, so I can send that your way.
Okay, so you have essentially detailed information on how stormwater would be addressed on site, how roads would be addressed on site. You essentially have most of the information that would be necessary to review a 160 lot plat. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, yeah.
So if we have most of the information necessary to review a 160 lot plat with the width proposed at 40 feet, not 60 feet, is there some reason we wouldn't have a SEPA review and a plat hearing with this variance request as part of the plat hearing? What am I missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're correct. That is a normal way of going about it. But again, what happens if the variance fails during that SEPA review? So then what happens? The whole thing is shelved. So I think that's where we're hung up. Is that say we had a plat for 160 units and it was like, but the variance is unapproved. Is that abnormal?
Sorry, the question to me would be, if the hearing was consolidated, if the plat hearing is consolidated with the variance, so you're essentially requesting approval of a 160 lot preliminary plat while also requesting a reduction in that minimum lot width from 60 feet to 40 feet.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying
would one get approved and the other not, is what I'm.
Well, clearly I would not be able to approve a 160 lot plat requesting 40-foot minimum lot widths if I'm hung up on the 40-foot minimum lot widths.
Okay.
But if I deny this variance request now, after the hearing, you're hung up anyway. So I'm missing how this process saves time. If you hadn't already worked out stormwater and roads and everything else I would need to analyze for a preliminary plat, I guess I could understand the applicant saying, if you deny my variance, you know, we're not going to seek a preliminary plat. But if the idea is I deny the variance and then you come back for 120 lot subdivision, you know, that de facto just proved the ask wasn't the minimum necessary, unless I'm missing something.
Right, but yeah, if it wouldn't be 120 lots,
Well,
for sure.
Anything less than 160 would prove it wasn't the minimum necessary.
Sure, sure. And in the document I provide, it's 120, and that's pretty close to the minimum necessary. So, okay.
So the document you provided, sorry.
The next one, yeah, the one I will add, you're calling Exhibit 7.
Okay, I apologize. Did I misspeak when I thought we were talking about a proposed 160 lots related to this variance?
No.
Okay. But the information you're providing relates to a proposed 120 lots, not 160?
Well, I mean, the 120 lots. So this deviation from standards, we put it out a while ago, right? And as we've dug further through the project, we're probably going to end up reducing lots by the time we get to the plat ask. So that's you know why we're in between here, but it's not going to get much less.
Okay.
Would you still need a variance on the 100 or the 40-foot variance on like a less than 160 lots? Is that what you're saying, Ryan?
Yes, we will need it for this project. Yeah.
Regardless,
due to the size of the wetland, like I say, what would happen is the lots will be 40 feet wide and they'll extend out. And so you'll have a lot that will meet the minimum size code, and then you'll have a backyard in a buffer as part of it.
and so again, the only sort of map I have is identified as, I think I identified as Exhibit 4. And let me see if there's a date on it. So you and I are looking at the same thing. It looks to be not on the map itself, but May 3rd is the date that I see, and it shows 160, not 120. It references a category 3 wetland and has sort of a basic buffer shown along with the type F stream.
Yeah.
Okay, but it doesn't, this map, from what I can tell, doesn't show me lot widths, actual numbers. This is just the sort of proposed layout. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a preliminary plat type map, right?
Okay, but then there's something else that's 120, not 160, a different map.
No, that's like a feasibility review of this project after this map is published.
Okay. In terms just basic feasibility, as it were, this category 3 wetland identified here, do we know what the required buffers would be for that category 3 wetland or the type F stream?
Yeah, yes, we have a preliminary wetland study. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can give it to you and show you how it all fits together.
Okay.
You can see, I believe, the buffer on the map of the type F streams. The wetland buffer is part of the flood program, so I'll it's on a different map, but yeah.
Okay, so there's, again, more additional information that is arguably relevant, but I don't have it, so we need to get that in the record. I guess my other concern is part of why we have this process is for members of the public to be able to review the information and provide their thoughts. And so all of this information needs to come in now, I'm worried, how do we get input from the public? I guess one option is leave the record open, for folks to then review all of the additional information you would like me to review and provide written comments. Your thoughts, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way. I think that's the only way. If we're gonna go through the additional information at this point, I think that's probably the only way.
I mean, I can make an oral ruling on this without the additional information if you'd like, but it's up to you.
And I think a big reason that we wanted to do this as well is because there is a lot of community input, and we would like to gather it.
Well, have you reviewed the comments that were provided to the city?
I have not seen them.
You haven't seen them yet either. Okay. There is a lot of concern either, based on my review. There were a couple folks that did express support generally for development, but in terms of specific comments, there was a lot of concern about, the critical areas on site for one, a lot of concerns about the existing flooding on site, and ensuring that a project of this size would not exacerbate existing problems, concerns about, protecting the environment, et cetera. All of those were expressed. Again, we haven't had SEPA review, and a lot of those concerns are the types of things that would be addressed through at least the preliminary stage at SEPA. Again, my challenge, I've never seen this before, to the extent that I really struggle again with the idea that, is it 160 lot plat, 120 now is potentially proposed. It's very challenging for me without any information to make a decision. I understand that you have information that you want to provide that I'm happy to include in the record, but my sort of gut feeling, and I'm happy to convey, I did email Mr. Bond procedurally and just to verify that a plat hearing would be required before the hearing examiner, make sure I hadn't misread the code. And he said, yes, it would be required. And I said, so SEPA review would occur at that point. He said, yes. That was the full extent of that email. I just want folks to know I did reach out to Mr. Bond this weekend to make sure I didn't misunderstand something. And that was the full extent. Mr. Bond, can you verify that that was the full extent of our communication? Essentially, you're verifying that, yes. I'll let you speak, Mr. Bond.
Yep, it's exactly what you just said. It would still require a preliminary plat review with the hearing examiner, and also included with that would be a SEPA. And then any additional was just forwarding you the information that you currently have.
Yeah, okay.
I'm tracking with you, and I agree that most of this information should come out during SEPA and be discussed at that time. I certainly thought this hearing was just going to discuss why the whys of the lot size reduction.
I guess I'm just not either smart or prescient enough to feel that I can make a conscientious decision on reducing the zoning code requirement without any of this information. That's the challenge that I face. If it helps, I can tell you that in other jurisdictions, it is not uncommon to have a consolidated hearing where a plat is requested that also requests deviations of various requirements of the zoning code, be that through a PUD or PDD, or even through a appended variance request. That would be a more common way forward in my experience. But my apologies, I just haven't had this happen before, Mr. Moore. So if you've had this happen in another jurisdiction and would like to speak to it, please do. This is unusual for me.
Sure. Yeah, no, the only way I've only had it happen with an administrative variance prior to the hearing. Yeah.
Sure. I guess that's one question too, Mr. Bond. Does the McCleary Municipal Code allow for administrative deviations up to a certain percentage when it comes to things like minimum lot width? I don't know the code well enough to know the answer to that, but
I believe it depends on what it is. Variance specifically, we go through the land use hearing examiner. Conditional use permits, I believe that we have, that goes through it goes through the city council. So it depends on what permit that we're asking, but there is very few that addresses, or administratively we can approve. Most of it goes to the land use hearing examiner.
sure. So I guess my thought was sometimes there's administrative deviations are allowed, where if you're only asking for a 5% reduction or a 10%, that can be done administratively versus 50%, or there's a threshold. But if that process doesn't exist in McCleary, that's fine. I just didn't know what the answer was.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, there's nothing that I found that shows that for administrative in the city zoning code.
In 1664, which is the deviation from requirements, it says two things. It says that I'm trying to find it now. The hearing examiner shall act on requested modifications prior to acting upon the plat or short plat. So that kind of made me think that maybe it happens ahead of schedule. And it also says in 1664-020, deviations or provisions from this title may not be applied for or granted, provided the director of public works may approve the deviation from the requirements without a variance. But it doesn't have a minimum. It doesn't have anything. It just says topography or unique conditions, which the city's in support of at this point.
So this is helpful. Thank you for cluing me into this section of the code. I hadn't thought to look there, because this is the chapter 16 of the code. Title 16 is under subdivisions, but under 1664-040, it says, unless exclusive jurisdiction for granting the variance is granted to the director, the hearing examiner shall consider a variance request concurrently with the land division to which it applies. And so to me, now that I've read that section, it would seem to indicate that a variance related to a preliminary plat ought to be heard concurrently with the preliminary plat. But do you read that language differently, Mr. Moore?
No.
Okay, given that, I have a suggestion, which would be, I believe this hearing is premature, and the appropriate step forward would be to essentially continue this variance hearing, ultimately consolidate it with any hearing on a preliminary plat that would be forthcoming, and that would all occur after SEPA review. Your thoughts on that?
I am tracking, and that's fine. The question is, how many lot plat are we going to apply for at that time?
I don't know. That's the point of, you need to decide what your ask is for. And in considering your preliminary plat as dictated by, again, that language in the code, I think, makes it pretty clear that I, the hearing examiner, shall consider a variance concurrently with the land division. You'll have to say, this is what we want in terms of a plat, and this is our ask in terms of the variance. And I'll ultimately have to decide whether it's appropriate or not. But I just don't see a way forward consistent with the municipal code that would allow me to decide this variance sort of, unrelated to any actual land division proposal. Okay, well, then I think with that, this is highly unusual, but that's the ruling I'm ultimately going to make. I'll go to Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, this is again highly unusual, and I know that folks have taken the time out of their day to participate, and I thank folks for their participation. But in my mind, I think it would be premature, A, to hear from all these folks, and B, to move forward and produce a decision specifically on this variance. I think the code envisions a consolidated process, and my apologies for not seeing that earlier, to the extent that, again, the variance request falls under Title 17 of the code, and it just so happens this is pointed out in Chapter 16, Title 16 of the code. But Mr. Bond, your thoughts?
Oh, I agree with whatever decision you come up with. So.
Okay.
No, I understand. I track it. I'm fine with continuing and getting additional information related to the plat and the variance at the same time.
Okay, so Mr. Moore, I want to ask you if you believe it would be better to have me produce a decision that you then, your client would have an opportunity to appeal under the Land Use Petition Act on just this variance request, I can do that. Or, the other option is, as I've suggested, which is we essentially continue this matter, noting that this variance request would ultimately be addressed with the preliminary plat, and you're welcome to alter what the request is asking as part of that. But I don't want to foreclose the possibility of producing a decision that you can then appeal if you think I'm acting in error. But I'm trying to be sensible as to how to move forward.
No, I'm fine with you continuing. We'll get all the public comments that are out there and make sure they're folded into our preliminary plat application. We've already got it done.
Okay.
So for this setup. So, I mean, you're not asking me to do a bunch of extra work. We were just trying to get this out ahead of us to figure out how much to pay for the plat and all that kind of stuff. So I think as long as I can get the public information, and I thank everyone who showed up, we will fold it in and work on your continuance.
And, ultimately what you have to pay, you'll work out with the city. I just trying to be helpful. One thought is potentially, you can pay part of it or whatever. And, I'll let Mr. Bond work that out with you. That's beyond the scope of what I myself deal with. But in terms of how we move forward, my suggestion, now it won't be a suggestion. What I'm ruling here today is this. This variance request is going to be continued, essentially. It may very well go away, who knows? But ultimately, the applicant is going to sort of append any variance requests they would like to make to their preliminary plat application. The city will then follow the review process under its municipal code for a preliminary plat, which will include that SEPA review. Unless I'm mistaken, Mr. Bond, I assume anything beyond about 20 lots requires SEPA review. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so definitely there will be SEPA review. Mr. Bond, do you happen to know, I don't know the answer, each jurisdiction is unique. In some jurisdictions, if there is an appeal of SEPA, an administrative appeal is possible to the hearing examiner that then gets consolidated with the open record hearing. In other jurisdictions, they do not allow such an appeal, and any appeal under SEPA has to wait until after a decision on the underlying permit or permits is made, and that gets consolidated with the Land Use Petition Act or LUPA. I just don't know the answer right off the top of my head, but if you happen to know the answer to whether an admin appeal is possible.
I'd have to look it up. Yeah, I have never seen it. I don't remember seeing it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. So,
okay, well, what I would suggest is when the city performs its review of the proposal, whatever that proposal ends up looking like, under SEPA and the State Environmental Policy Act, when the city issues its threshold determination, whatever that determination is, please ensure to include information on if an appeal occurs, how that works. It's important to know because I don't want to run into other procedural problems in the future. And again, the two options are, depending on what the municipal code says, if there's an appeal possible administratively, that would be consolidated with the open record application hearing. If no administrative appeal is possible, then it waits for LUPA. And I'm not saying anyone will appeal the SEPA determination. I'm just trying to make sure we don't have to come back a third time, as it were, and make sure everyone's on the same page. So I'll let you look into and work on how that would work. But essentially, what we're going to do is we're essentially going to continue this matter. All folks that have provided comments, those comments are going to continue to be sort of kept by the city, and we'll make sure that when we come back for the preliminary plat hearing, should that hearing occur, obviously, those comments will be included, and folks, notice will be provided of a preliminary plat hearing, the application, the SEPA process, et cetera. So the record will be such that if folks have additional thoughts, they'll be able to provide those. But what I will say is, Mr. Moore, I don't need any further information yet. I'm going to wait until I get a request for the actual plat hearing, and we'll get that on the books, and then city staff will provide all of the exhibits related to both the plat and any variance request as part of that, and then any public comments can all come in as part of that as well. Does that make sense, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, I was uncomfortable with trying to send stuff out of school, as it were, that wasn't related to the plat. So yeah.
Okay, so Mr. Bond, are we on the same page as to next steps?
yes.
Okay, so again, members of the public, my apologies for not allowing folks to testify, but in my view, my decision is it would be premature at this point. But ultimately, if a plat hearing is scheduled, folks will have the opportunity, and further, we'll work out the tech, or potentially, depending on where we are in terms of COVID, it might be possible to have in-person participation. I just don't know yet. I'm not making any promises, but I do thank folks for taking the time to participate, and any comments, thoughts you have, obviously can be conveyed to the city. Again, any ultimate hearing on this variance is going to now be consolidated with the preliminary plat that is the sort of underlying bigger decision that is at stake. So with that, I am going to ultimately conclude today's hearing, noting that no decision is forthcoming. Essentially, what I have done is continued this hearing, and I have determined it will be consolidated with any hearing on the preliminary plat, which is the sort of major application that is associated with this proposal. Okay, so with that, we're going to end the meeting. I thank everyone, and I wish everyone safety and good health. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.